Thanks very much, Kristin, and thanks to the organisers for inviting me and having me here. This is my first HBES meeting, so it's very exciting, slightly nerve-wracking as well, coming from a zoological background to be talking about evolution of human behaviour. But I thought I'd take the chance to tell you a bit about some recent work I've been doing with my colleague Bram Kuijper. He's at the University of Exeter, their Ecology and Evolution campus. And we've been trying to apply some ideas about kin conflict, kind of emerging from work on animal behaviour, non-human behaviour, and applying those, or that way of thinking, to look at evolution of mating preferences in humans. So I'm hoping all of you will be able to tell me whether these ideas sound like they might be relevant for thinking about human behaviour or not. So, yeah, the evolution of homosexual mating preferences. So I think it's pretty well established these days that diversity of sexual preference is pretty much a fundamental feature of human nature. So certainly homosexuality is culturally widespread, highly prevalent, evolutionarily ancient, but it's also the focus of a lot of research interest. So I just dug a few kind of quotes from recent papers here to sort of give a bit of a flavour of the kind of commentary. It's perplexing from an evolutionary perspective. That's a quote from a paper by Rice et al. It challenges evolutionary thinking. It requires explanation when viewed in the context of natural selection. So all these sorts of comment are highlighting the fact that homosexual mating preferences are kind of widespread. They are to some extent heritable, or there's evidence suggesting heritability in mating preference, and they seem to be associated often with reduced reproductive success. So if you're taking a kind of straightforward Darwinian point of view, then that okay, I'll try and come a bit closer. Thanks for the yep, better. Okay. So there's a lot of interest in evolution of mating preferences and homosexual mating preferences in particular. They pose this sort of evolutionary challenge. So there's much discussion in the literature, lots of theories and models, lots of suggestions been made, and among them is the kin selection hypothesis. So this is a kind of well-established idea. It's been around for a while. Summarised here with a quote again I've taken from a recent paper, this time by et al. So the kin selection hypothesis suggests that men displaying a homosexual preference could redirect their parental investment toward nieces and nephews, thereby compensating for their reduced direct reproductive expectation by investing or by increasing their inclusive fitness. So I think this is an interesting idea, and it's been a topic of much debate and discussion. I think it's fair to say evidence is mixed, and the debate goes on. But what I want to do today is tell you about a slightly different approach we've been taking, which also invokes the idea of kin selection, but focuses less on the idea of kin-selected helping. So the classic kin selection hypothesis here, the emphasis is very much on kin selection as selection for targeted helping. But I think kin selection is relevant more broadly than simply when we're looking at targeted helping. So there's a lot of interest at the moment in studies of behavioural evolution in other species of the impact of local kin competition on behavioural evolution. So the kind of classical theory of life history evolution tends to focus on the lifespan of a single individual, looking at kind of trade-offs across one individual's lifespan, when do you invest in reproduction, or do you invest in survival? But if you're looking at a highly social species, like humans, for example, this sort of isolated view of life history of a single individual, I think, is not really enough. You have to take into account the social context and the fact that one individual's reproductive decisions inevitably impact on the fitness of other local individuals, and particularly on the fitness of locally competing kin. So from this point of view, kin competition can shape behaviour even beyond actual sort of direct targeted helping of relatives. Basically, for organisms that live in a structured population surrounded locally by relatives, pretty much anything one individual does is going to impact on the fitness of other local kin. So any change in mortality or fecundity is going to affect the intensity of local competition, with inclusive fitness consequences when you live surrounded by relatives. And any factor that kind of modulates local relatedness or the intensity of local competition can therefore have big effects on behavioural evolution, especially if these sorts of demographic factors have differential effects on different classes of actor. So what Bram and I have been doing is kind of trying to apply this idea of local kin competition in a structured population and looking at how potentially it might influence the evolution of mating preferences. So we're focusing on the impact of ecological or demographic factors like dispersal and mating skew, how they affect local kin competition, and then what that means for the evolution of heterosexual and homosexual mating preferences. So this is a kind of application of kin selection, but a little bit different than the classic kin selection theory of homosexual preference. We're invoking kin selection, but we're not really focusing on kin-directed helping so much as just these inevitable side effects where one individual's reproductive decisions impact on the fitness of local relatives. We don't want to kind of rule out this idea of kin-directed helping, but it's not kind of central to the argument. So what I'm going to do then is go on and describe a kind of simple model we've built to look at how these demographic factors might shape the evolution of mating preference. And I have to say this is a kind of very general model. It's not really tuned for humans specifically, but I think that's kind of no bad thing in a way, because I kind of want to make the point that a lot of these processes that might influence the evolution of human mating preference are ones which apply very generally and would be relevant in any kind of social species. So I'm going to describe this kind of simple model, sketch out how it works, and then I'll show you some of the results and some of the predictions we can derive from it. I apologize in advance. I'm used to kind of talking about these models often with kind of application to birds or other mammals in mind. So I find myself slipping very easily into sort of rather non-human language. You know, if I start talking about large broods or competition for breeding vacancies or whatever, it sounds a bit odd in a human context, but I think the basic principles still apply. So we're going to think about evolution of mating preference in a kind of spatially structured population. So we'll model this in a very simple way. We're going to imagine a population that's structured into discrete groups. So it's a kind of infinite island population, a large population divided into distinct groups, and we have a certain number of adult reproductive females and males in each group. So NF females, NM males in each group. And time proceeds and through a series of discrete time steps. So in each time step, adults mate at random to produce lots of offspring, and we can have some parameter that determines whether mating happens within a local group or more broadly in the population at large. So there'll be some probability, here I've denoted it G, that an offspring is sired by a male from its local group. with probability 1 minus g, it might be sired by a more distant male. And once offspring have been born, they can either remain in their natal group or disperse. And we can again have parameters that specify the rates of dispersal, which may differ for both sexes. So a fraction HF of female offspring remain at home, 1 minus F disperse, and a fraction HM of males remain in their natal group, while the rest disperse. Once offspring have dispersed, we have death of adults. So each time step, there's some probability, mu F, that a female adult will die, mu M for a male. And then offspring in a group or on a patch, both native ones who were born and remain there and immigrants who've dispersed in from other patches, they compete for the resulting sort of vacancies created by death of adults of their own sex. And those offspring that fail to obtain a kind of breeding position die. So I think it's easier to kind of visualize this graphically. So here's a kind of schematic picture of what's going on. We've got our population divided into groups, just showing 3 here, but we've got to imagine a much bigger population with a whole array of local groups. And in each group, we've got our NF females and NM males. So in this example, I've got equal numbers of males and females per group, 3 in each. But we could make that different. We could have some mating skew, where we've got, say here, fewer males than females per group, or the other way around. Let's go back to 3 males, 3 females in each. So in each of our time steps, first we have reproduction. Adults mate at random to produce lots of offspring of both sexes. And remember, each offspring can be sired locally or non-locally, and we can specify the probability. I think I've changed my notation here. I switched from G to M, but it doesn't matter. There's just a parameter specifying whether mating happens locally or non-locally. Then we have mortality of adults. Some die. And again, we've got parameters specifying mortality rates for both sexes. Those deaths create vacancies for which offspring compete, but before competition happens, offspring can disperse. So remember, for male offspring, there's some probability HM of remaining at home versus dispersing, and for females, some probability HF. So in this little example here, we've got a lot more movement of the females than the males. So I'm assuming female bias dispersal, but we can adjust those parameters however we like. And then once dispersal has happened, the offspring compete for the vacancies, both the offspring native to the patch and those who immigrate. The vacancies are filled, and the remaining offspring then die. And then the cycle repeats. So as I say, this is a pretty simple general model. It's obviously a very kind of schematic picture of a structured population, but it does allow us to capture the impact of kind of competition among relatives within a local group or patch. So that's our basic demographic setting. But what we're interested in is how the parameters of this demographic setting, the rates of dispersal and mortality of the sexes and so on, how do those influence the evolution of mating preferences? So again, we're going to have a kind of simple schematic model of development of mating preference. And the way we're going to think about that is to suppose that the development of androphilic or gynophilic mating preferences depends on the level of some developmental cue, which is normally distributed with a sex-specific mean. And there's some sort of threshold, call it the orientation threshold, above or below which an individual is going to develop androphilic or gynophilic preferences. And where that threshold lies relative to the mean of the Q distributions for males and females is going to determine, therefore, the frequency of heterosexual and homosexual preferences among males and females. So again, I think that's easier to see with a picture. I fear my male and female symbols, which have come out as strange circles here. But I hope you get the idea. We've got some developmental cue here. That could be something like the level of fetal androgens or something, and there's a threshold. This cue distribution differs for females on the left here, for males on the right. Above that critical threshold level, we suppose you develop gynophilic preferences, below that androphilic. And so the majority of females, given this cue distribution here, are going to develop androphilic preference, but some, the shaded pink portion over here, are going to develop gynophilic preferences. And for males, the majority fall above the threshold and develop gynophilic preferences, but some will fall below the blue shaded region and develop androphilic preference. So again, this is a very schematic model. I wouldn't want to argue that it's something as simple as just the level of fetal androgen, which kind of determines development of preference, but it's just a way to kind of formalize and capture the notion of a developmental system that gives rise to diversity of mating preference, and in which we can look at the evolution of the balance between gynophilic and androphilic preference, because we can think in terms of our model about the evolution of the value of this threshold. So if we push the threshold one way or the other, I hope you can see it shifting there, we're changing the relative frequency of homosexual preference among the two sexes. So if we push the threshold to the right, then we're going to get more androphilic men and fewer gynophilic women, or vice versa. If we push it the other way, then we get more gynophilic women versus androphilic men. So as the threshold changes, the frequencies of homosexual preference among males and females change. So here, as we shift the threshold left or right, from this sort of situation to this sort of situation, the frequencies of homosexuality among males and females change. And I'm going to kind of focus on the ratio of frequency of homosexuality among males to females as the main sort of response variable, so we can make predictions about how that shifts as our threshold evolves. One further thing to say is that in the model, mating preference could influence fitness, could impact on fitness, or could influence reproductive competition at two different life stages. So the model is obviously simplistic and has a kind of basically a biphasic life cycle in which first juveniles compete for kind of adult reproductive vacancies, and then if they claim such a vacancy and become a reproductive adult, you then get competition among those adults over production of young. And we might imagine that sexual orientation could influence competitive effort at either stage. So individual with homosexual mating preferences might be less likely to compete for a kind of reproductive vacancy, and or might invest less effort in reproductive competition if it does claim such a vacancy. So we'll look a little bit at the kind of timing of expression or impact of orientation on both kinds of competition. So what we're doing is we're looking at how the model parameters influence the evolution of the orientation threshold, which determines the relative frequencies of male versus female homosexual preference. Now, it's always a bit frustrating kind of presenting a model in a talk like this, because I can't really give you all the full details of what's going on under the hood, as it were. Obviously, if anyone's got any queries, I can try and give you a bit more information down the line. But just to sketch out the approach, we're going to take an adaptive dynamic approach. So we imagine that evolution proceeds by successive substitution of mutations of small effect, with a clear separation of demographic and evolutionary timescales. So we imagine a series of small mutations, each of which slightly alters that orientation threshold and look at the rate at which those mutations spread through the population or are eliminated from it. So solving the model basically involves looking at how model parameters determine the levels of local relatedness between males and females in groups, and then based on those working out how selection acts on the threshold, taking into account the impact of local kin competition. And we do that using a kind of neighborhood modulated fitness approach. So we can calculate the selection gradient on the threshold, the partial derivative of a mutant's fitness with respect to its individual threshold value, taking account of correlated changes in the thresholds of other individuals in the groups, with the correlation there depending on the relatedness of those individuals to the focal mutant. I have to flash up a token slide of equations. Very informative, I'm sure. I won't really actually delve into the details here. I mean, here we're tracking relatedness between females in a patch, between females and males in a patch, or between two randomly chosen males. And we can write down here recursions for how these average relatedness coefficients change from one time step to the next. You know, if I pick the relatedness between two randomly chosen females, this first term here, both the females I pick might be survivors from the previous time step. So that's with probability 1 minus MF squared, where MF's female mortality, in which case the relatedness between them will be the same as it was on average in the previous time step. Or I might have picked one adult survivor female and one sort of new juvenile female, in which case the relatedness will depend on the probability that that juvenile has stayed in her natal patch, and so on and so forth. As I say, it's not very helpful kind of delving through the details.